over. I know with how late it is, we may have a fewer people. This is the very last part of the day after a good conference, but I'll go ahead and start by welcoming you to our session on Farm Bill advocacy. I'm Cathy Day. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the climate policy coordinator for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. It's also known as NSAC. And with me is my colleague Hamza. So Hamza, would you like?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Cathy, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone, at least evening on the East Coast, and good afternoon, etc., for wherever you are on the planet. My name is Hamza Ganapathy. I am the policy fellow with NSAC, and I'm really eager today to be here with my colleague, Cathy, to talk to you all about Farm Bill advocacy.
Thanks, Hamza. And we'd also love to know who's here in the session with us. So if you could just put your name, your role, and your organization in the Zoom chat, whether it's a farm, a nonprofit, or whatever you do, just to give us a little bit of a sense who's here. And so that'll help us to frame up some of our more interactive parts of the conversation a little later on. So just name, role, organization in the chat, and we'll try to get a look at that as we get a little bit further along. And then all of this session is focused on Farm Bill advocacy. So we're starting from knowing that we have a Farm Bill that was passed in 2018, and that Farm Bill will expire next year. At the end of September 2023, that Farm Bill expires. And so the hope is that we have a new completed Farm Bill by that point. So our question that we're going to be exploring in this session, but especially by the end, is how do we get the kind of Farm Bill that we want to have it passed by that time and really having a lot of the pieces that we're interested in. So we're going to start with a few other pieces. First of all, we're going to tell you a little bit about NSAC so that you know our role and how we tend to advocate in the space and who we represent. And then we'll be talking a little bit about the history of racism and the Farm Bill institutions, as well as giving an overview of the Farm Bill itself, what it contains. We'll talk about the processes that create the Farm Bill, and then we're going to dig into advocacy. And at that point, we're going to start getting into some interactive pieces of the session. So we'll dig into learning more about your representatives together. We'll do a breakout session around that. And we will come back to consider the issues on which you'd like to engage your representatives. So we'll have some time to be thinking about which issues matter to you and with whom you'd like to talk about them. So first of all, we'd like to talk a little bit about NSAC itself. We are, again, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and we're a grassroots alliance of over 130 member organizations around the country. And we work together to improve federal food and farm policy, and we've been doing it for over 30 years. And we have a wide variety of organizations in our network. They include the Women, Food and Agriculture Network, but they also include a lot of others. Some you might know, for example, might be the Organic Farming Research Foundation, the National Center for Appropriate Technology, Practical Farmers of Iowa, the Northeast Organic Farming Association. The list goes on, but you get the sense it's generally food and farming organizations of a variety of sizes and a variety of activities. But all of them get together with us, and the way that they work is that we listen to those experiences on a regular basis. So we start with our farmers and our stakeholders, and we hear from farmers most of the time through our member organizations rather than directly, but we do also do things like farmer listening sessions. So for example, throughout conference season last year, a lot of what we were engaged in was hearing from farmers about the issues they felt needed to be raised in the next Farm Bill. We also meet through a variety of what are called issue committees with our members, and those issue committees are places where our members bring those concerns from farmers on a monthly basis and tell us what they want to change and how they want to go about improving the policies in the Farm Bill. So when those farmers and stakeholders flow with their information, or I should say flows into the member groups and then into NSAC, we here at the staff end, especially those of us based in DC, are working to try to identify our top policy priorities. So we do that in collaboration with our members, and then we take those policy priorities and evaluate what we're going to spend the most time on in relation to Farm Bill. And then with those tools and with those awareness of what our top priorities are going to be, we go to Congress and we go to federal agencies. And we ask the Congress to do what we think needs to be done in the Farm Bill, but we also advocate after the Farm Bill passes and throughout, especially in a year like this, which has had a lot of new activity on the legislative end before the Farm Bill even passes, we also advocate with places like USDA to make sure that the policies are implemented in the way that seems to best serve our constituents who are small and medium scale farmers. And we try to ensure that we're moving ever closer to well serving our farmers of color as well. So I'm going to pass it off to Hamza at this point and hear a little bit more about the history of the Farm Bill.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So that all is an introduction to NSAC and everything that we do, but of course the heading of our session here today is the Farm Bill, so let's get into it. Before we actually jump into the content of the Farm Bill itself, we wanted to set the stage of some of the historical context in which it has been operating in historically and where it's descended from. So in the 100 years and more since the first Farm Bill, the US government and many of its residents, citizens, and even other nations have engaged in the expansion and colonization of the Western Hemisphere, specifically this continent. And at around the same time, slavery was growing dramatically and then had been outlawed except for cases of punishment for crimes, and it was replaced by prison labor and sharecropping. And this is also the period when the first of the braceros programs that started came to shape our future temporary farm worker programs here in the United States. So even looking further back than that, the stolen land and labor underpinning our agricultural system goes back to the very founding of this country. Our agricultural system was established based on land that's successively been stolen from tribes through unfair treaties, through legislation like the Homestead Act, and through broken treaties. And the map you see here on the screen, it kind of starts to show that history of land loss and kind of also explains why legislation is such a big deal for us. It was legislation that started stealing this land, and we're hoping that legislation will also change the system. The system of agriculture we have is also based on stolen African labor, and we've especially been reliant on its enslaved African people for our agricultural economy throughout history. And it's important for us to name this history because the early farm bills, in many cases, explicitly excluded farmers of color and communities of color in how programs were set up and delivered, and directly contributed to these generations of land loss. And for example, because most farm workers at the time of the New Deal were people of color, farm workers were explicitly excluded from minimum wage protections. And in addition, USDA often refused to give loans or denied program payments to people of color, which drove land loss even further for Black and Indigenous farmers. So we're still navigating this historical context today, and you don't have to look very far before you see how racism has been built into the structures of our current farm policy. And this gives us an opportunity to advocate for shifting policies to become more equitable. And Kathy, I think we can go to the next slide. Great. So just an example of how racism and its impacts are actively affecting farm policy today. We wanted to show this map to you all. So this shows the percentage of CSP acres that have been enrolled in a state by individuals and farmers identified as socially disadvantaged farmers in fiscal year 2018. Now, the scale on the far right of your screen is small here. So I will just say that the lowest number, so that's that bright pink color, represents 0%. And the greatest number, that's that light green color, represents only 10%. So our scale here is from 0 to 10%, not 0 to 50, 0 to 100. We're still in a very narrow level of enrollment. And so many states, especially in the middle of the country, are at 0%. And even the greatest states are still only in that neighborhood of around 10%. So a vast minority of acres enrolled in CSP are being enrolled by socially disadvantaged folks. And this is one example of many structural inequities that have played out in farm policy. So a lot of our member organizations, advocates, and farmers have long been working for policy changes to address these kinds of inequities by instituting policies like special funding for groups, like dedicated funding, like set-asides, for groups like farmers of color who face significant discrimination at the hands of USDA historically, and to redress ongoing harm, and by redesigning programs and policies to work more equitably in general. We want to make sure that benefits don't disproportionately benefit larger farms at the expense of smaller, diversified, sustainable operations. And we're hoping that by improving the policies in the Farm Bill, it'll be a way to address inherent inequities and to advance more equitable policies for everyone. And with that, we can go to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Hamza. So with all of that history in mind and that still existing challenge within the programs, we do have to recognize that we've made some progress. So for example, Hamza mentioned the set-asides. We've got within the conservation programs a 5% set aside for what the NRCS calls socially disadvantaged farmers, farmers of color, as well as a 5% set aside for beginning farmers. So it's a beginning. There is some money intentionally and intensively set aside for those groups, differentially conducted across different states, but at least it's in federal policy. In addition, we have the Outreach and Assistance for Socially Disadvantaged and Veteran Farmers and Ranchers, more commonly known as Section 2501. And 2501 has been a really useful project for getting people involved in the kinds of education and farmer training that they most want to engage in and most prepare them for farming. We also have the nutrition programs that have helped to move a lot more money into the hands of those who need the access to food that is otherwise lacking. And we have the other healthy food access programs that are helpful as well. So some progress, but we here on the NSAC end have been working at the individual, staff, NSAC member level, organizational level, to change some of how we're approaching all of these policies, because we recognize that the policies have been problematic and that we need to stop and rethink how we're approaching policy, as well as stop and think about how we're approaching the work that we do with one another. So some of the questions that we're raising are, what are the ways in which we're upholding systems of oppression in our own food systems work? That's a common question that runs through a lot of threads across our issue committees, for example. And what are some resources or skills that my organization or farm has access to? Who do we serve and support with those resources? So those are some of the questions we encourage folks to raise as we engage in conversation with stakeholders. And who is left out or who doesn't have access to these resources? And that continues to be a challenge to address. There is a lot in USDA data that does not adequately cover those questions. So that is another area of advocacy for us, is to ensure that we have some work to encourage USDA to further build out the programs that are tracking some of that data. Right, so we're going to jump into the Farm Bill itself at this point. And so we just want to flag that as you're hearing the overview of the Farm Bill, you should think about the Farm Bill issues that matter to you. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, when we get toward the end, we're going to be asking you to talk about the issues that you care about in the Farm Bill. So just pay attention, maybe make some notes if you're thinking about specific things you want to be sure to raise, or just pay attention to perhaps the area of the Farm Bill that's going to be of most interest to you. And I'll note at the end, we're going to have a list of the titles in the Farm Bill, so that'll help you to think about different areas that you might not otherwise be bringing to the front of your mind, but that may be important to you in your work. So I'll hand back over to Hamza for this section.
Great, thank you, Cathy. So let's dive in. What is this big thing called the Farm Bill that comes up every 4 to 5 years? Well, simply put, it's a large omnibus multi-part piece of legislation that's developed roughly every 5 years. It primarily shapes what we eat, what farmers grow, who accesses land and capital, and the health of our natural resources. It also contains policies and programs and funding for everything from rules around who is eligible for a farm loan, to funding for a food assistance program, to anything that might assist low-income families and other socially disadvantaged farmers or ranchers. It addresses a whole host of different policies and programs that help our agricultural system run. And while it reflects deep-seated structural inequities, much like those that we've spoken about already, it also presents a really great opportunity to drive change. And that's why we're here today. So we'll go to the next slide. Great. So the Farm Bill is kind of like this Swiss Army knife here. It's a really comprehensive tool that accomplishes a lot of different things, and it's really handy to have and to make really good use of. So the Farm Bill influences primarily what we eat. It shapes commodity programs. It makes certain foods cheaper than others. And our nation's farmers are really impacted by the Farm Bill as well, because it determines which crops and which farming practices receive federal support through research programs, conservation programs, innovation, and farm safety net programs, all of which help make certain practices easier or harder for farmers to maintain. Our environment and natural resources are also impacted by the Farm Bill by determining the degree to which farmers can control water pollution, air pollution, damage to ecosystems in their area, and the impact of energy intensive farming systems. And finally, the economy itself is highly affected by the Farm Bill. It shapes job opportunities, crop insurance, credit, and the development of farm infrastructure, among many other things that have direct impacts on our economy. Go to the next slide. So let's take a look at the breakdown of what the Farm Bill actually looks like. So when we're advocating for change in the Farm Bill, we really want to make sure we understand which programs are making up the Farm Bill, what the breakdown is, so that we can talk really well about where funding is going and where we might want to see changes. As with the original New Deal that kind of provided a lot of the early inspiration for how farm and food policy happens today, a lot of the focus of the Farm Bill is making sure that people have enough to eat. So the biggest portion of the Farm Bill, as you can see here, is that giant three-quarters section, which is nutrition programs, which include programs like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and especially in 2018, you can see it did make up about 75% of Farm Bill funding. And then when we focus on the approximately 25% of the Farm Bill that's remaining, there are three major areas that really show up in a big way. The first is crop insurance, which is actually the biggest of the three pieces there. At about 9% of the 2018 Farm Bill spending, it represented the most substantial way that the Farm Bill put money directly into the hands of farmers. But the close second is commodities spending. It's shown there in yellow. And these are direct payments to farmers that are often based on what they grow, with a few parameters around who actually gets that money. And note that when you put those two together, crop insurance and commodities, so that's that red and that yellow wedge there, they account for about 16% of the total Farm Bill. And most of that spending represents payments to the largest scale farmers. So certainly some of the payments are going to support small and medium scale farms with insurance programs and other support, but most of the money is going directly into the pockets of those who are controlling the largest amounts of land. And the last larger portion there is conservation programs shown in blue. So it also represents about 7% of the Farm Bill spending from this 2018 bill. And these are the programs that help to move our nation's farmers towards practices that are decreasing greenhouse gas emissions and reducing their pollution into waterways, and also hopefully rebuilding tons of soil that we've lost through damaging agricultural practices throughout the history of agriculture in the United States. The last set of spending here is that the small black sliver says the other, it's about 1%, and it includes programs like research, credit, and rural development. It's a much, much smaller bucket of spending, but it's still very central to supporting research advances, credit for farmers who can't access it elsewhere, rural livelihoods, and rural life in general. And it is important to notice that the whole Farm Bill from 2018 was more than $320 billion. So even 1% is still a massive amount of money to be working with. And it's always important to remember the scale of what the Farm Bill is really doing for agriculture. Thanks, Cathy. You'll go to the next slide.
Thanks, Hamza. All right, so as we go on the path toward a new Farm Bill, one of the things we need to recognize is how it actually moves through Congress. And in the case of the Farm Bill, we have each house drafting its own version of the Farm Bill. So that will start out within the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee. And so it will be very heavily shaped by the folks who are in there, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Once those committees have a version that they are completely comfortable with to the largest degree that they can get some agreement across the committee. They vote it out of committee and it moves into the full chambers. So it moves into the House, it moves into the Senate from the respective committees. And at that time, there's potential for floor debate. There's an opportunity for amendments. A lot can change out on the floor because you go from having a relatively small group of folks to having everyone who's in the House or the Senate involved in potentially shaping the bill. So it really matters the degree to which folks on the committee have had a chance, have taken the opportunity to shape what everyone is thinking about in approaching the Farm Bill itself. So ideally, there's going to be a lot of input that they're taking on board, but because there are so many people on both sides, there can be a lot of push and pull that may happen during the floor debates. Once each of those houses has a decision, has a vote, then the bills go out to conference committee. I'll note that this is in theory. A lot has happened in the last few farm bills where conference committee has really sort of been an afterthought. There's a lot of closed door talking that happens that kind of pulls together the farm bill from the House and from the Senate without really being an official conference committee. However, in theory, that's what is supposed to happen, is that both bills go to conference committee. Everybody from the two agriculture committees sits down and hashes it out. It's usually a little bit of a select group rather than the full committees, I should say. And those folks then send their final version of the bill back out to the House and back out to the Senate for another vote. And at that time, you have a single version of the bill that gets that final vote. Once it passes both House and Senate, it goes to the president for signature. So those last pieces very similar to what you might hear for any other bill that tends to get into the news cycle. When we're looking at who really matters in all of this work, the House and Senate Agriculture Committee, as I noted, have a lot of power. So those who sit on those committees are most likely to influence the shape of the bill. They're most likely to get their own priorities into the bill rather than the priorities of other folks out on the floor. That does get shaped once it goes out to the floor, but generally the full kind of breadth of topics that are covered is pretty well hashed out within those committees, and a lot of the details of what the particular policies look like are hashed out there as well. However, as I noted, Congress as a whole matters too, because there's always an opportunity for changes on the floor. And of course, the president as well, the degree to which the president gets involved in trying to affect the way the policy looks in the end, the degree to which the president is advocating for certain specific pieces of legislation can matter. And of course, the president does have the opportunity to veto a bill that the president doesn't like. Within all of that, it matters that we out into the rest of the country, we grassroots voices, so to speak, are having an opportunity to influence the bill. So we can do that. We can directly contact our Congress people, but we also have other avenues. And I'm going to have Hamza take that piece in a couple of minutes. But your grassroots voices really do matter for shaping what the Farm Bill ends up looking like. And that's because all of our representatives and senators, they care about what you have to say. In the Farm Bill, there are a couple of people who are most likely to be key and have the most power for what the form of the bill is. And that is the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, who will be Senator Debbie Stabenow, and the chair of the House Agriculture Committee, who is likely to be Representative Glenn Thompson. So both of those folks, since they have a fair amount of power, they're going to be listening to their own constituents first and making sure that they get what they want, but they also have a role to think about how other members of the agriculture committees are participating. And so they are going to adopt their methods that they think appropriate. For example, we often hear that on the Senate Agriculture Committee, Senator Stabenow allows the offices who are on the committee to have a lot of influence over their particular chosen area of legislation. And so it's all up to how those leaders choose to operate, but they will very much shape how everyone else has an opportunity to shape the Farm Bill. All right, so I'll hand it over to Hamza again.
Great, thank you, Cathy. So having heard all of that and kind of the importance of tapping into the right representatives and senators and making sure that our voices are heard, how can we plug into the Farm Bill? Well, it all starts right here today. Right now at the end, I hope, like Cathy said, if you're taking notes on the issues that are important to you, and maybe if you're from Michigan or Pennsylvania, you're hurriedly writing down those names of Debbie Stabenow and Glenn Thompson. But you can even share your feedback with us today. We want to hear your ideas, concerns, questions, even solutions for the programs and policies that we see in the Farm Bill. We are all ears on how you want to shape this legislation in the coming year. We also really encourage the idea of ongoing support. There's been a lot of incredible WFAN pals and coworkers and supporters that I hope everyone's gotten the chance to meet over the past few days. And of course, there's always other food and agriculture groups hopefully in your local area. A great way to get involved is through food policy councils and similar groups, which offer a great opportunity to learn about work going on right in your community and to coordinate with like-minded individuals who are also working on food and farm system issues. And of course, next year is the big deal when the Farm Bill will really start to take shape. You can help us make sure Congress knows what important issues to stand up for when they're considering all the legislation that'll go into the Farm Bill regarding sustainable agriculture, local food, and so many other important facets of food systems. You can sign up for updates with us at NSAC to stay informed of all the ways to get involved, which we will drop in the chat before the end of the session today. Go to the next slide. All right, so engaging with our elected representatives. I hope you're all inspired to find out who your representatives are and to start contacting them. Right now, we're actually going to walk through an example of how to find out who your representatives are and what role they play in federal agriculture policy. We're going to look at an example from my home state, which is Connecticut. And in a moment, I will start sharing my screen and we'll walk through how to find who your representatives are and how they're engaged with agriculture. All right. Can you all see a screen? It says congress.gov and find your members. Okay, got a couple thumbs up, so that's perfect. All right, we'll be dropping the link to this website in just a moment, but for now, we're going to start here. So this is congress.gov. They have a resource on finding any member of Congress, so in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, for wherever you live. And all that really you need to know is a zip code. So I'm going to go ahead and in this main box here, which is find your members, I'm just going to put in a Connecticut zip code right here and click search. All right, so pretty quickly, the website brings up a map that would show me my district in Connecticut, if I can zoom out far enough. It's right there. And I can see that first senator is Senator Richard Blumenthal. The representative for this district is Johanna Hayes, and the other senator for Connecticut is Chris Murphy. So for this case, I'm going to look at Representative Johanna Hayes. So if I click on her name, we get a quick profile view. So this is her personal website. So that's where you can find out about how to contact either her Connecticut or Washington, D.C. office, the issues she's working on, the services she provides to her constituents, etc. Where she's located here in Washington, D.C., her party and her district, so District 5. So while this gives us some basic information, I want to direct your attention over to this right side panel, which on this member, we're looking at the second option here that says view member committee assignments and recent votes. So while knowing the issues that Johanna Hayes is working on is really important, how she influences the House and where she sits and what she's voting on is what we really want to know, so that if we can get a meeting with her or talk to her about Connecticut agriculture, we know what she's already doing. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Great. So we come to another profile page here, and we see another overview and contact. This is again her Washington, D.C. office, her personal House website. And lo and behold, Johanna Hayes is actually on the House Committee on Agriculture. So this is really valuable information for anyone who is working on agriculture policy in the 5th District of Connecticut, because Johanna Hayes actively plays a role in that initial step of writing the early versions of the House Farm Bill. And so meeting with her and asking what she's doing, what she cares about, how she's incorporating her ideas into the Farm Bill, and how she's representing the district are all going to be really critical parts of the early Farm Bill process. So we can always use these kinds of profiles to understand what members are doing, how they're voting, and to choose strategically who we engage with. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And perfect. So there is the link in the chat right there. Our NSAC updates are the first link. I will personally let you know that I write our weekly update newsletters. So if you subscribe to them, you'll be hearing from us very regularly. And the second link there is congress.gov's Find Your Member feature. And with that, I think, Cathy, we're walking into our interactive activity.
Yeah, so we're going to take you out into a couple of breakout rooms. I need to double check that we're actually in different ones, Hamza, I just remembered. So I'll send myself to the appropriate room in a moment. But we'll just break it out so that each of you can have a little time to look up your own member, ask any questions you'd like, and we're going to bring that information back to the full group so that we can talk a little bit about Farm Bill issues. So the idea is that you have a chance to look at a little bit about your representative and how they represent themselves on their webpage, so you can see how they think about the issues before we kind of dig into some of the issues that you think are important, and potentially think about how you might want to go about talking about your issues with them, given the way that they present themselves. Anybody have questions before we head out to the breakout rooms?
I have one quick question. I hope it's a quick question. Do you know if there's a already designed or a populated database of who's on which subcommittee? Just like a quick look, like if you could have a database that said, here's who's on the Senate committees, here's who's on the House committees, and here's what subcommittees they're on, so that we could like cross-reference that.
We have places we can look at the House and Senate Ag committees as separate entities. I'm trying to think if there is something that's comprehensive without just going through each representative, and I don't think we have comprehensive lists, because those lists would be so very long. And the way we usually get to this stuff is through Political Pro, which is a subscription service. So I think the best will be, we'll just share out the links for the House and Senate Ag committees, so you can check if your folks are on those, and then we can look back and see if there are other committees that really matter. For example, if folks want to look at ag appropriations, we could do that as well.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, Jules, absolutely. I will say, just to go off of what Cathy said, we went through an example today where if you needed to start with who your representative is and figure out where they sit accordingly, that's kind of the approach we've taken today. But another approach, like Cathy mentioned, is you can go directly to the websites of the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee, and there'll be very clear, lists with photos of every senator, where they're from, who's on that committee, what they focus on. All of that is there. So that is another method of getting to similar information. We just thought we'd give people a chance to dig into their own local area and work up from there today.
Yeah,
That's great.
All right, so we're going to take it out, and we'll give folks enough time in the two breakout rooms to at least make a start. We may not have time to roll through everybody's details, but we do have a fair amount of time left in the session, right? I'm losing track of when we started. How much time do we have left at this point?
I think we have until 7:30.
7:30. So maybe we can take at least 15 minutes, 20 minutes for people to look through, and we'll come back sooner if needed.
6:30.
6:30 Central, 7:30 Eastern time. Yes.
Apologies for our confusion on the Eastern time piece.
Yeah. Wait, no, we're going to be in other good sessions. Yep.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to open the breakout rooms. If you can just jump in there, and you'll find Hamza in that room if you're over there, and I will be joining the other breakout rooms shortly to offer any help that you might need.
Hi, Kathy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Hi, you can hear me. This is Liz. I literally jumped on about 30 seconds ago, a minute
All
ago
right.
in here. And if there is, of course, now I'm lost. I'm not sure what, maybe I should pull back out because I feel like,
No.
what,
You're great.
jump
Uh,
into a room here? Can you,
Can you see the breakout rooms even though you
there we
just came
go.
in?
Now, here we go.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. And I
I
see,
didn't I didn't get a breakout room.
yeah, it looks like you didn't either. All right, I'll assign you. Give me 1 second.
Thanks, Kath.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Anybody else need help before I jump out into the room 2? All right. You should be jumped into breakout rooms. We'll be back here in about 15 minutes. If you're just going to hang out, just make sure you come back in about 15 or so that you make sure to catch the rest of the presentation if you'd like to. All right, we'll see you soon if you're not joining the breakout rooms. Looks like it's all of us from room 2, so we'll give the other group another 30 seconds to roll on back.
The other thing is solar in Iowa. I tried to get solar installed and found out that the electric company in Madison County was not going to buy back any of my solar. And so that the payback or break even is like 20 years or more, versus California, my break even payback is 7 years because the electric company out here has to credit me the overages. And I just think it's really awful that that's even legal. And it's very disincentivizing in Iowa to put solar installations in. So I think we gotta fix that.
Yeah, and that before I jump right back to everybody else, I'll just note that that often is an issue of state level legislation. And so that's probably going to take advocating with your state legislature. But just so we can pull everybody back in here, I am going to have a quick review slide for things that you can do to get started on this. Bring that up. So we talked about going to congress.gov to find your members. And we're glad to share these slides, by the way, if you would like to have them so that you can track these websites back down. They're also in the chat in some cases. And then if you want to go to the specific House and Agriculture committees and see if your members sit on those committees, you can go to the 2 websites listed there. And then we walked through finding some of the key issues. One of the folks we looked up in our group had priorities as the label for that. Sometimes people list issues. The 2 that we looked at most closely had the issues or the priorities listed under their about part of their web page. So you kind of have to poke around sometimes, but digging into the individual member's web page is really helpful to figure out your first approach to them, to know if they already support your issue. If they already do, you've got a much smoother path to talking to them, and you may not have to have quite as heavy a lift to talk to them. So what we want to dig into together, and that's what we were already starting to dig into in room 2 at the end there, was the issues that matter to you in the Farm Bill. And the idea is that you be able to speak to those issues with your representatives. So you've gotten a chance to see a little bit about who your representatives are, do a first pass at least at digging into what they think about some of these issues. So what we'd like to do here is have an opportunity for you to raise those issues together, maybe talk a little bit about some issues that you might share, strategize with us or with others in the room about how you might want to go about approaching your representatives or approaching an advocacy organization on these issues. And NSAC is one of those. So definitely, if you're a member organization, I hope we're already involved in conversations with you in some way. So to get into those conversations, I just wanted to make sure the Farm Bill titles were in front of you. So we've got the commodity programs and conservation. Those were 2 that were in that, the larger wedges within the 1/4 wedge that Hamza showed you a little while ago. So they're both larger pieces of that quarter that doesn't focus on nutrition. And then there's the trade, nutrition. Nutrition, of course, is 3/4 of the bill. There's credit, rural development, research, extension, and related matters, which means things like education for the most part, forestry, energy, horticulture, crop insurance, and miscellaneous, and some things that fall into places like miscellaneous might be things like bits and pieces of the organic program, although most of that falls into the horticulture title. So just to give you a little bit of inspiration, and what we'd like to do is just have some conversations with you. So we had a couple of people already raise a couple of issues. Has anybody else had a chance to think about some issues that they'd love to advocate for, and what might be an issue that you're interested in? And feel free to raise a hand if you feel more comfortable that way, or just to jump right on in. Yeah, Angie.
Yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to like what you've heard in terms of the Biden-Harris strategy to end hunger by 2030 and like how that's going to be informing the Farm Bill negotiations, because that's a very visionary and ambitious plan they've put together.
I'll note first, INSEC does not advocate on nutrition and hunger issues. We fairly carefully stay out of those conversations because of some of the conflicts they raise and because our member organizations don't tend to work in that space. That said, it does seem that they're interested in taking those issues into the Farm Bill. Exactly what that's going to look like, though, is going to very much be shaped, I think, most of all by what Senator Stabenow is interested in carrying in that regard. And we do have the challenge that there has been a whole constituency within the House on the Republican side that has suggested the idea, once again, of separating the nutrition section of the bill out from the Farm Bill. So there may be more focus on that than on getting those transformational pieces in.
Because it seems like a really good opportunity for local and small scale agriculture, right? That this is a
Absolutely.
rural development project, a huge
Yeah.
rural development project. I mean, I just see so many ways that this could really help where I'm at in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We have so many small scale and mostly women farmers, as well as indigenous farmers on reservations. And it just seems like a tremendous opportunity to highlight the need for small scale, local, non-traditional producers.
Absolutely. Before I go to Urban Agriculture Network, I'm going to ask your name in just a minute, but before we go into that, does anybody else have any thoughts about those programs for Angie?
Great.
Anybody else interested in the same programs or anything? Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, interested, yes, but just only because I don't know anything much about it. Yeah,
That's helpful too, though.
I'd like to see the research and extension piece given some
Some extra weight.
focus.
Great. Okay. So one of the things that you'll want to do in advocating for that work, Angie, is again, making sure that you've checked in with what your representative stances are on those things. But also it's probably worthwhile to make some contact with the White House in some form or fashion. If you believe that what they're doing should be carried into the Farm Bill, the more people they hear from telling them that they need to be carrying those things into the Farm Bill, the more likely we're going to see them advocating, because the Biden administration has taken very variable approaches to advocacy. Sometimes they get somewhat involved in what's happening in Congress and sometimes they don't. And the more we push them to do so, the better chance we're going to have of getting them on top of those nutrition and rural development pieces. Let me bring in Stephanie and we'll see if we are adding some more.
Hi, so I don't even know where this would, it seems like most of the issues that affect me directly probably fall under miscellaneous, which is kind of funny. So this is a big conversation that's happening in Atlanta right now. I know that the FSA has programs and incentives for housing purchase, rural areas specifically, but there's a housing crisis in Metro Atlanta. There's obviously like a land access crisis too, but there's like really a burgeoning urban agriculture movement. And we've been talking about what it would look like to create some kind of housing incentives or housing for people who are doing this work. If it would be in partnership with HUD or any kind of maybe radical changes to how these systems operate right now. But we're just watching a lot of our neighborhoods, turn into investor scooped up Airbnbs, rents, going into the $3,000 a month range for houses. And then where there's like apartment housing, a lot of it is in really substandard conditions. So just thinking about what opportunities might be there, or if that's just totally outside the scope of what we could try to push for in this Farm Bill.
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephanie. Certainly, I would highlight, first of all, that land access seems to be a key issue throughout a lot of Farm Bill platforms, and it's a key concern for everyone who's working in urban agriculture and small and mid-scale farming. Everyone is looking at the need for more land access, particularly for farmers of color. And generally speaking, housing issues specifically are not going to fall into the Farm Bill purview. However, other land access issues do. So for example, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program can be used as a way to move farmland into the hands of those who otherwise might not be able to access it. So for example, when people are moving land into easements, when they're selling land that's under an easement, they can move that land, they can sell that land to somebody else, essentially enabling themselves to have a price break because they get a tax break if they sell it to somebody who is a farmer of color or a beginning farmer. So the ASEP program, that Agricultural Conservation Easement Program in the Title II, is one place where we can see some change. I am not aware, and this is in part a weakness of our organization. We don't have a lot of people. We have some organizations, but not a preponderance of organizations working in urban agriculture. So I'm not sure how common it has been to have easements occurring in urban spaces. And maybe somebody else here has some sense of that. But that can be one approach, but also seeing if the farmland has some other protection attached to it. If it's on the urban edge, it's possible that it could be farmland that's considered important in one of the designations of farmland importance. If it's in the urban center, it's probably less likely, but that's where we can start to look to putting things in the credit title, for example, to ensure that organizations or individuals can purchase the land and then put those protections on it potentially to keep it from being bought out from underneath them. But the housing issue in and of itself, that's a challenge. And it's, it very much, and I'm going to pause in just a minute, but this is very much an issue that we need to see tied into the Farm Bill, but it's definitely not one that is currently in the Farm Bill, the way that the bill is set up. And so the synergies that it has are not necessarily accounted for anywhere in the bill. Anybody have other experiences with that?
I actually used to work for one of the only land trusts in the country that does traditional conservation easements and community land conservation in Athens, Georgia. So they protect like a historical corridor of Athens. It's under heavy development pressure to keep affordable housing there, which is extremely difficult work using ground leases. But they also do a lot of traditional easements, and they're actually working. There's a new organization here. I can't remember the name of it. My former boss, who I used to farm under, was one of the first farmers to actually get land. They're purchasing land, and it's definitely more rural, but they're purchasing land. On behalf of farmers, and farmers are able to kind of like lease to own the land. So it's an interesting program that's kind of brand new, but there's like 5 or 6 farmers who've become who've gotten on the path of land ownership working through them. I don't know what the urban potential could be for that in the future, but definitely interesting.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And honestly, anything you can share with us, both here and if you're interested offline afterwards, if you wanted to send us an email or something. Like I said, we have limited expertise and limited membership right now in urban agriculture. So understanding more about how land access issues are working and hearing more about the Athens corridor would be really helpful to us. Even links, so we understand what's going on there, could be really helpful for our advocacy.
For sure.
Oh, and I do see there's some in the chat as well. Doesn't look like anybody has questions there. Are there other issues that all of you would want to raise with your representatives? Have you heard anything that you would also want to advocate on as well? Want to make those links with other people? Go ahead, Joanna.
I brought this up in the breakout room, but it's under the category of crop insurance. And so it's not compared to some of these other issues, it's just a small one. But when it comes to organic or regenerative farming, the policies and the rules for insurance don't often align with what our practices are. And so we've run into issues where we do a procedure that is normal for organic farming, but it's not acceptable practice because it's written for conventional big ag farming. And so then we're denied insurance. And we've talked with RMA, we've talked with our Organic Association, whatever, and this is a big problem for organic farmers. So I guess the issue is it better to go as an organization. So like we work with the, Iowa Organic Association, for example, to advocate with it? Or is it a both and where we need to write individually to a senator or representative, as well as working to that to try to figure out how to get rules that are more appropriate to support regenerative ag?
That's another great question. I would say both and is always important, but when you are working with a state-based organization, if you are, for example, addressing your senators, you're probably going to have a stronger voice as a coalition because all of you are from Iowa and talking to your Iowa senators. If you have folks who are in the district of your representative and then other folks who aren't, it may be really important to have each of you who are in the district of that representative going and sending letters, talking to them as well. But if you have a statewide organization and you're working together, that's probably going to be your strongest approach. So it varies depending on whether you're talking about House or Senate. But they're also always very responsive if people are farmers or farmer advocates or farmer educators in their district, but especially farmers themselves. So if you all are farmers, they will like to hear directly from you too. And the more they hear, so just to give you an example, we had a fly-in a couple of years ago and before the pandemic, and we'd had some of our member organizations calling to senators and representatives' office in advance, but they were calling on behalf of their organizations. So they weren't calling on behalf of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And so for several days, some of those folks had been hearing that they needed to take action on a certain policy. And then a few days later, NSAC staffers along with some farmers came into the room and said, hey, you need to take action on these things. And they said, oh, we've been hearing about this. And they didn't even realize that there was a link between all of us. And so it made a bigger impact because they were seeing that there were multiple voices asking for the same thing. So it really is a combination of having a quality message and making sure that they're hearing it from as many people as they can. So the more you can organize with others, the better off you are.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll add crop insurance is one piece where we're working quite a bit on the NSAC end, and a lot of our concerns are related to the fact that there's inadequate coverage for small and medium scale farms in particular. And so we're looking at what some of the potential improvements are for the whole farm revenue protection program, because we hear from people who say that it doesn't really represent their farms well because they have 30 different products and they get a break for a maximum of 8 different products and really for 3. So looking at ways to ensure that people get enough of a break for the number of different products that they have is really important, but also trying to figure out if we can put some caps on the biggest insurance programs, the commodity covering programs, so that there is money to ensure that people can get access to the smaller programs as well. And that includes ensuring as well that insurance providers are educated about the whole farm revenue program, because what we're hearing in a lot of states is that some insurers aren't really even providing whole farm revenue protection. They simply don't even mention that they have those policies. And so that makes it impossible for smaller growers to even find someone close by who can give them advice about them. Alyssa, I see your question in the chat. Small and medium scale farms, and I'm afraid I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but they're defined by acreage and by sales. And so it depends which one we're talking about. And it also—
I believe small is under 150,000 in sales a year, and very small is under 75,000. That could be, those might be low numbers. I was surprised when I remember seeing them. I'll look it up really quick.
Yeah, thank you, Jules. That's so helpful. And thanks for putting the link in the chat, Hamza. That's helping too. We also note that in terms of perception varies quite a bit from place to place. What we call small in Iowa in a colloquial way at least, is quite different from what we might call small in Vermont. But there are specific definitions in USDA.
Right.
Right, so same couple of questions. Are there any other issues you're likely to raise? And have you heard from somebody else that they're likely to be raising an issue that's also important to you? Either one of those. Right.
I know.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned that you don't do much with the nutrition, but I am currently getting my master's in nutrition. Um, so I'm very interested to see what the plans are as far as that. I think also looking at what sort of crops are subsidized because unfortunately the types of crops that are generally subsidized are also the ones that are most directly correlated with metabolic dysregulatory diseases such as diabetes and um, fatty liver disease and stuff like that. So I think it might be beneficial to address two titles with one thing by replacing a lot of the funding for the deleterious food crops that are being harvested and processed, and instead focusing on more regenerative and organic practices that would benefit both the soil and humans.
Yeah, absolutely, Kitty. There are a lot of ways in which all of these programs across the Farm Bill have a variety of different intersections with one another. And one of the things that that I've noted happen recently was that in California, there was a large coalition that got together at the state level to change their policy so that they could ensure that those intersections were clearly laid out in policy so that food access was tied with nutrition, was tied with conservation, was tied with marketing programs. And so they just worked out a method. It wasn't easy because it was across many different organizations, but they got a bunch of people together and they advocated across a bunch of different counties and were able to create some new programs that really worked off those synergies between nutrition and farming. It's a little harder to do at the federal level, partly because there are some really vested interests and some regional interests that affect the ways that a lot of the Farm Bill tends to play out. But that said, the more we can think about, as you said, regenerative practices, we know that diversity is really important to ensuring if we have crop diversity and livestock diversity help to build soil biotic diversity and all of that. As we start to get more people out on the land, working the land to have those more complex systems can also mean that more people can get involved in agriculture. So all of those things really do tie together. And if we start thinking about making good conservation programs, as long as we keep in mind and create policies that tie them together, it's offers a lot of potential for synergies. But as I say, it's challenging at the policy level because of how much a lot of this is entrenched in regional interests.
This is Ruth, and I guess I'm interested in the forestry part because I think there's data about planting trees and the carbon sequestration. And when I have planted trees, the funding has been really, really low. And so it's almost a joke of a level low. And there's just so much care in the first 3 years with fencing and mulching and watering and all the labor that it takes to actually grow a tree. And so it was nice that there was a little funding, but it was like a tenth of what it might, of my cost. And so I would think that would be something that I would want to bring up because as the planet warms, the trees are key in sequestering that carbon and cooling things down. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah. Do you know what the program was to which you got payments for that, Ruth?
It was either REAP or equip, but it was probably equip, I think. Yeah, it was a windbreak design and a field break and then a windbreak design with item native trees and shrubs. And it was just very little cost share at all for that whole thing.
Okay, that's really helpful to hear because out of the two big kind of project-based conservation programs that are direct government payments, so the EQIP and Conservation Stewardship Program, we generally think on our end of EQIP as having the higher cost share. And so hearing that even the cost share there is not sufficient is really useful. There's some of what we're advocating is more support for agroforestry broadly in the Farm Bill, and that would include planting things like windbreaks and so forth. There, of course, as you experienced, there are already conservation practice standard payments for things like windbreaks and related trees and in buffers and along riparian areas and so forth. But what we hope to see is that we can also encourage productive trees in those spaces while maintaining high diversity, high presence of native species and so forth. But it is a challenge when the cost share is not sufficient. Were you able to find other sources of funding for it, or was the EQIP sort of just barely enough?
Fortunately, the Environmental Defense Fund had given me a grant to do a pollinator installation on retired crop ground. And I had some sort of extra quote unquote money that I could put towards some of the fruit trees and some of the trees. So they didn't seem to mind, but I'm really out of pocket, like at least 80% on the install of these 300 trees and shrubs. Because there's so much deer pressure, you truly have to fence every tree. Otherwise they'd be eaten. So, and not to mention, the mulching and all the other things that are going on. So yeah, it was worth it for me. I would do it regardless, but I think, if we want people planting trees, especially on, conventional corn, soybean land, and it's going from crop to trees, you've got to incentivize that and help people out a little bit more than they're doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Get the Youth Conservation Corps up and going again. I mean, I know it is partially, but gosh. People to work.
Really robust Conservation Corps would be excellent.
Yeah.
Any other intersections you all are seeing or policies that you'd want to raise yourselves that you haven't heard so far? Trying to leave plenty of wait time, so hope everybody's enduring the silence. All right. Did I hear another voice?
I guess. Did you clarify there, Cathy? Did you say that the bill itself, that nutrition actually takes up 3/4 or something?
That's right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
yeah, that's some of what Hansa walked through a little bit ago. I'll just bring that graph back up for a moment so you can see.
Missed that one.
Yeah, so it's quite a significant portion of the bill. And as Katie noted, it's important that we find the synergies between the nutrition and the other pieces of the bill. And certainly conservation and nutrition work together quite nicely, as do a number of things in the miscellaneous part of the bill. But the commodity and crop insurance are less oriented that way.
Sure. Okay. Great. Thank you for bringing.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Maybe I'll take a picture.
And that is on our blog as well on wish I remembered the title off the top of my head, but it's an analysis of the 2018 Farm Bill after it was completed.
Okay. Huh.
Can SNAP Ed use any funds to support small local farmers or local food systems? This is where my lack of experience with the nutrition programs makes things a little more difficult. Thanks, Hamza, for posting that. I don't know what the ED part stands for. Can somebody fill me in there? Education? Okay. That's a great question to which I do not know the answer. I will note that we have a lot going on with advocacy in the local agriculture marketing program, including a marker bill that we expect a large portion is likely going to be, it's got some space to get into the Farm Bill. It has a lot of support, and that is working on procurement that would allow schools, for example, to designate certain kinds of food. So for example, if they want to buy local food, they can be allowed to buy local food. If they want to buy organic food, if they want to buy food from, you know, some kind of designated region or some kind of certification, parts of the work that are going on in the local agriculture marketing program could potentially allow for that procurement to happen. And so that would kind of tie into education better being linked to food procurement. As regards SNAP in particular, though, like I said, since we don't work in that space, I don't know the details. So I'm not really sure whether or not SNAP can be directly used to support, SNAP Ed can be used to support small local farmers. We know, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Double Up Food Bucks, which is one way in which farmers market can be used, whether SNAP rather can be used for farmers market purchases. And if you were at the keynote this morning, you also heard about how it's being used for some CSA programs like that in Albuquerque South Valley.
Yeah, yeah. So awesome.
Yeah. Got just a couple minutes left. Any other issues that you all would like to raise that we haven't heard about yet?
I don't think it's in here, but I would love, and some of the other questions I've had raised in other places is there doesn't seem to be any kind of subsidies for workers on farms, like to be able to bring folks up to a living wage or even approaching a living wage. And I feel like it's one of those issues that gets caught between the tracks. Like you were talking earlier about housing. It seems like the same thing happens with pay, right? Like, I'm not sure where it would fall under, or if it just is like, oh, that's not the Farm Bill. That's got to go under, you know, something else, labor, you know. And it's like, well, but then labor says, oh, but this is specifically farm labor, so we don't touch that. That goes back to the Farm Bill, you know. So then it just ends up in this, you know, void of nothingness.
It does, yeah. And most things related to farm labor do not fall in the Farm Bill, and that makes it very complicated. So Department of Labor, when you're talking about pay, OSHA, if you're talking about worker safety. And so it's spread over a lot of other places. And part of the reason that it is not built into the Farm Bill already goes back to the history, the 1933 New Deal Farm Bill that specifically that Farm Bill and other parts of the New Deal, I should add, that excluded farm workers from pay protections. And that, you know, is part of that racist history that Hamza outlined. And so figuring out how to make those pieces come together is a big challenge, and it's spread across a lot of different advocates. So it's really hard to bring everyone together to make change, especially because the Farm Bill is this big thing we can all get together on, whereas all the things that need to be done for workers are spread over a bunch of different pieces of legislation. Well, thank you all so much for participating. I should bring up our last slide. If you'd like to reach out, the one that you can see is that it's got C Day, that's me. It's pretty obvious, but Policy Fellow is just Hamza. So if you'd like to write to either or both of us, we're very glad to hear from you. we'd be glad to, hear your summaries of what you brought up today. If there's something in particular you think we might be able to address, or if you just have follow-up questions or want to find out something more about NSAC, we'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for all the work you're doing and all you gals for the issues you brought to the table in this conversation.
Thank you so much. Great
you.
session.
Yes. Bye.